It's a cold, grey dawn on Palm Sunday in the year 1461. In a barren field in Yorkshire, England, two great armies are about to do battle. As snow begins to fall, men-at-arms on both sides offer up silent prayers for deliverance and for victory. They all know that in the coming fight, no quarter will be asked and none will be given.
There was this blood feud. He killed my father, he killed my brother. I think that's central to a lot of why the wars were perpetuated.
These were people who were not thugs in armour. They were people who had ideals and loyalties and also had to fight battles.
Soon, the sky becomes dark with deadly arrows and men scream as they are hit. But this is only the beginning. The first furious charge comes and the full savagery of medieval combat is unleashed. Men hack desperately at each other. Skulls are crushed and limbs are severed. Blood splatters the snow and covers the ground. The Battle of Towton is in full cry. By the end of the day, almost 30,000 men will lay dead.
The way to success, the way to survival was to get through the other army as fast as possible.
Most people would have been killed by standing 3 feet away from the enemy, the length of a hand's sword, and that would have been frightening to the extreme.
These were not normal war wounds. They had been overkilled, and it's clear from these injuries that there was an element of viciousness.
Towton was just one of many brutal fights to the death in the bitter struggle for power between the houses of Lancaster and York during the Wars of the Roses. The phrase, the Wars of the Roses, is taken from the emblems that were adopted by the two opposing sides, the red rose of the House of Lancaster and the white rose of the House of York. Decades of ill feeling between the two sides finally boiled over into full-scale war during the middle years of the 15th century. The antagonism was mostly caused by a single matter: the disputed succession to the crown of England. The origins of the Wars of the Roses can be traced back to the previous century, to the long reign of King Edward III, when England was fighting what became known as the 100 Years' War with France. Edward was a powerful and successful monarch who fathered 7 sons, 5 of whom lived to become adults. The eldest of these was Edward, the Black Prince. The others were Lionel of Antwerp, Duke of Clarence, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, Edmund of Langley, Duke of York, and Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester. As the eldest son, the Black Prince would have succeeded his father had he not died 1 year before him in 1376. And that was why when Edward III himself died in 1377, the throne passed to the Black Prince's son, Richard of Bordeaux, who was then just 10 years old. So, Richard of Bordeaux became Richard II of England. The early years of the boy king's reign were successful. The suppression of the peasants' revolt in 1381 suggested that England had a king who was a worthy successor to Edward III. Unfortunately, Richard was very good at making enemies with the English nobility, including his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Lancaster, whom he exiled in 1398. The following year, Bolingbroke returned at the head of a small army, intent on seizing the crown from Richard. Henry's small army should have been no match for Richard's, but the support of the nobles helped to sweep him into power. Richard was placed under arrest, and by February 1400 he was dead, murdered almost certainly, by starvation possibly, but far more likely by poisoning. So, Richard Plantagenet was gone, and England had a new king, the Lancastrian, Henry IV. Henry IV spent most of his reign dealing with rebellions and threats to his authority. The problems originated from the fact that, as Henry was the son of the third surviving son of Edward III, his claim to the throne was not as strong as his cousin, Roger, Earl of March. March was descended from Edward III's second son, Lionel, Duke of Clarence. This was an inconvenient problem for Henry, but he solved it by arresting the Earl and throwing him into prison. Leaving nothing to chance, the king also seized his cousin's estates. The seeds of the Wars of the Roses had been sown. By 1415, Henry IV was dead, and his son, another Henry, Henry V, had taken the throne and turned his attentions to renewing war with France. Henry was determined to achieve the dynastic ambitions of his great-grandfather, Edward II, and add the crown of France to that of England.
In Henry V's eyes, France was England, and should have been England, because France was ruled by petty kings. So it was one of those problems where it was the king's prerogative, if you like, to go over to France and secure his kingdom.
Henry achieved his ambition largely because of his great victory at Agincourt in 1415. This famous battle paved the way to a short but brilliant military career that left Henry as the regent and heir of France. Henry V died in France in August 1422, aged just 35. Recent studies have suggested that the cause was probably cancer and not dysentery, as was thought at the time. The good news was that Henry V left a son and Lancastrian heir to the throne. The bad news was that Henry VI was not yet 1 year old.
Henry V and Agincourt reverberate through the 15th century. They'd set an amazingly high standard for their successors. The victory at Agincourt and then the conquest of northern France had led to the Treaty of Troyes, and Henry V was now the heir to the Kingdom of France. But after he died, what would happen? People wanted to keep the conquests. After all, so many people had died in winning that land. But at some stage, events and alliances would turn against the English. At that point, it would really test the successors of Henry V and his nobility. Would the people of the mid-century be able to live up to the standards of the past? That was the test they faced.
During the infant king's minority, England was ruled by a council of rich noblemen who spent a great deal of time arguing, jostling for position, and wrestling with the thorny question of France. The council was led by the king's uncle John, Duke of Bedford, who looked for a peaceful settlement with the French to guarantee English gains in northern France. Unfortunately, other noblemen didn't agree. The king's other uncle, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, was very pro-war, and there were heated arguments at court.
Henry was put in charge of his two uncles, Bedford and Gloucester. Gloucester was at the head of the faction, if you like, that wanted to pursue the war in France. Bedford was not so much wanting to pursue the war, and in the end, it was almost factionalism and the contributory causes round that caused the problems in France. And the French problem was always a problem that someone was trying to find a scapegoat for.
Henry VI's minority was the most successful part of his reign, possibly the only successful part of his reign. he becomes king at 9 months old, so we have a minority of 16 or 17 years. While he was young, the council actually ruled quite successfully. There are rival characters, notably Cardinal Beaufort and the king's uncle, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. And they have their arguments over policy, and at times it looks really bad. But either the king's other uncle, John of Bedford, steps in, knocks their heads together and sorts things out, or the two men step back and realise that actually the greater good is the greater good of the country and of the young king, and also a sense of they need to do their best for the memory of Henry V. So, by and large, the country is run as well, if not better, during Henry VI's minority than at any time during his reign.
With no powerful unifying figure in command of her army, England's position in France quickly worsened. It didn't help matters when a French army, inspired by an extraordinary peasant girl called Joan of Arc, defeated the English and had the Dauphin crowned at Reims in 1429. The only answer was to pour further resources and manpower into a big defensive effort in France. Over the next few years, fighting a rearguard action would cost a great deal of money and bring very little reward.
France is a wonderful burden, I think you could put it like that. And it felt important for the empire that the English had built up in France to be retained. And after all, Henry VI is the only king in English history who has been crowned king of both England and France. So people wanted to retain his twin kingdoms, but to retain a kingdom against the aggression of the French as it developed required a huge commitment of men and money at a time when England didn't have a standing army and it wasn't used to raising taxes on a regular basis. So that was a huge burden.
In 1432, John, Duke of Bedford, died. For the next 5 years, the minority council carried on, governing as they all quarrelled and fell out with each other. An illegitimate branch of the royal family, the Beauforts, became prominent members of the council and became confidants of the young king. As Henry VI grew older, the Beauforts strengthened their position at court. Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, was not a happy man. Henry VI finally assumed power in 1437. He was a religious, scholarly man, but he was weak, a poor administrator, financially incompetent, and had little feel for court politics. No king could have been less suited to his age. Under Henry, the nation's bulging coffers were drained as a host of hangers-on and royal favourites were given titles and lands. Edmund Beaufort, later the Duke of Somerset, and William de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, were among the ambitious nobles who were promoted rapidly by Henry. The established noblemen of England found the creation of so many new lords, each with their own retinue of retainers, very worrying, and it was no great surprise that they were all soon arguing over land and property rights.
Henry VI was quite simply a disastrous king. A king was expected to be decisive, to take decisions. How should we defend Normandy against a French attack? How should I deal with a nobleman who's causing trouble? It requires a decision maker. And Henry was not a decision maker. He may not have been a simpleton, but he seems to have been a cipher, somebody who really played no part in politics whatsoever, leaving a vast vacuum at the centre of government.
When he was in his minority, he should have been a little bit more like his father was. Henry V was the typical sort of medieval knight, goes into battle, takes all his men across to France, beats the French, gives them a good kicking and comes back home. Henry VI was the total opposite, and unfortunately his nobles ruled him. And that was not to say that Henry was being manipulated, because he was quite vindictive, was Henry, apart from being quite pious and had a lot of other qualities which were good in a king, but not a medieval king. A medieval king had to bring all his power together, control his nobles, in the extreme, take them abroad and beat the French in that instance. And if he could do that, then he could control his nobles. Henry couldn't do that.
It used to be thought that the nobility of the 40s simply took advantage of this, and people like the Earl of Suffolk stepped in, put their arm around Henry's shoulder and systematically looted him of money and offices. It's total selfishness. Recent research has changed that picture very considerably. What now appears to have been the case is that people like Suffolk in the 40s and Somerset in the early 50s were actually trying to fill the vacuum, that the nobility came together, working together to fill the space left by Henry. Yes, they did well out of it, but actually they were putting the country's interests and the king's interests first by trying to support him, to cover up this absence of leadership. And it couldn't last, because the way the system worked, you needed a king.
The year 1445 saw a royal wedding. Henry VI married Margaret of Anjou, a match that was supposed to strengthen English claims in France. She was only 15 at the time of her marriage, but Margaret would eventually become a formidable figure during the Wars of the Roses. The marriage was arranged by the Earl of Suffolk, who was elevated from Earl to Marquess for his efforts. While tensions still simmered beneath the surface, everyone gave the impression of being behind the king and his administration. Everyone, that is, apart from Gloucester. But in February 1447, the Duke's troublemaking and plotting finally caught up with him, and he was arrested on a charge of treason. He died in custody 3 days later.
The one exception to the nobles working as a united group seems to have been Humphrey of Gloucester, who all along wants to push for the French war to be continued at a time when the realization has developed that it's very, very difficult to maintain France. And we shouldn't see the people who supported that line as defeatists, because Suffolk had a long military career. He'd been held prisoner for quite a time in France. Somerset had a successful military career until 1450. These weren't defeatists who'd never seen a battlefield. I think they had come to realise that the English position there was becoming close to undefendable. But Gloucester's always wanting to be back there fighting, although actually it was a long time since he'd actually set foot in France. So his death in 1447 led to a lot of rumours that perhaps he'd certainly been arrested, led to the rumours that he'd been murdered, but there is no evidence that that was the case.
Less than 2 months after Gloucester's death, his old foe, Cardinal Beaufort, also followed him to the grave. These 2 deaths made the Earl of Suffolk the main power behind the throne. In 1448, he was created Duke, as was Edmund Beaufort, who was given the title Duke of Somerset in recognition of his military service in France. Nothing could have infuriated their enemies more. Dukedoms were usually reserved for direct relatives of the reigning monarch. With Henry's clique running the country, others saw their influence diminish. The most powerful of these was Richard Plantagenet, Duke of York. As Edmund of Langley's only son, York was heir apparent to the throne, and his hatred of Suffolk and Somerset steadily grew as his role in government receded. York had held the prestigious title of Lieutenant of France and had been entrusted with the command of the English army on the continent. Now he had to look on helplessly as he was replaced by Somerset. To make matters worse, he was then packed off to govern Ireland, miles away from the royal centre of power.
The very fact that the English government was centralised was a factor that everybody knew and took interest with. So if the king was devolving laws, for instance, who was actually devolving those laws? Was it the king or the king's advisors? So everybody had an interest in who was actually doing that. The Duke of Somerset, for instance, became a court favourite. He was the king's right arm. Obviously, York was suspicious of this because York had his own interests to look after, and after the French wars, he was owed quite a lot of money by the crown as well, which caused him to be fairly disgruntled, but I don't think that was the actual cause of his animosity, if you like, towards Somerset. I think it was more of a fact that he had to protect his own family and interests.
It's possible that York was concerned that Somerset was a dynastic rival in terms of an alternative heir to the throne, although in practice Somerset did not have as good a claim as York. Yes, Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, had royal blood, but the Beauforts were in an illegitimate line from Edward III. It's doubtful that Somerset ever really took seriously the possibility that he could be king. It's far more likely for Somerset that he was very keen to support Henry VI.
Sadly for the ambitious new dukes, everything soon started to go badly wrong. Problems at home did for Suffolk, who carried the can for the corruption, lawlessness and chaotic finances which were a hallmark of the later years of Henry's reign. Early in 1450, the king was forced by the Commons to send Suffolk into exile as punishment.
At that point, he really must have thought that he got away with it, because a soothsayer had told him to beware of the Tower, and he must have feared that he'd end up in the Tower of London and meet his death. So he sails away. Partway across the English Channel, another ship comes into view, and as that ship gets closer, they realise that its name is the Nicholas of the Tower. That ship comes alongside, the sailors board, Suffolk is taken, hauled into a rowing boat, and his head is cut off, and his body's thrown onto the beach at Dover. The soothsayer was right in the end.
With Suffolk dead, the king's other favourite, Somerset, was in a very difficult position. The war in France was proving to be disastrous, with the armies under his command fighting a series of losing battles with the French. By the summer of 1450, the bulk of English possessions in northern France were back in French hands. With a weak monarch in charge, and with wild rumours circulating that the French were planning to invade the Kent coast, the situation was bad enough to spark a full-scale popular revolt led by Jack Cade. Cade's rebellion was a desperate action by ordinary men whose families had been crushed by unfair taxes and the corruption of the ruling classes. The rebels issued a list of grievances against the king's government and demanded that the Duke of York be recalled from Ireland to replace the king's corrupt advisors. There were sad echoes of the peasants' revolt 70 years earlier. The rebels had some early success, were bought off with false promises, officially pardoned, and then hunted down and murdered. Cade himself fled to Heathfield, a small village in the county of Sussex, where he was eventually cornered by the king's troops and killed. His head ended up on a spike on London Bridge.
Popular discontent, if you like, was brewing throughout the period and had done previous to that as well, in the Peasants' Revolt, for instance. But in the 1450s, there was a lot of discontent in Kent. Kent was quite a rebellious county.
Cade's rebellion doesn't come out of nowhere. The problems in England in 1449 had led to a lot of protest. Everything was going wrong in France. there was a growth of disorder around the country. There were economic problems. There were problems in the wool and cloth trade that was leading to higher prices, lower wages, unemployment. There was widespread discontent over a number of areas. And Cade's rebellion in the summer of 1450 starts off peacefully. And the people involved, they're not rustic yokels. These are the leaders of village communities, the constables, people with authority. And they head for London to protest. And their demands are written down carefully. They're submitted to the nobility. But then it goes wrong. Violence gets underway. London begins to be looted. Lord Say and others are bloodily executed and their bodies dragged around London. It takes the Londoners themselves to throw Cade's rebels out. Where was the king? Well, they couldn't have expected defence from Henry VI. He was in the Midlands, probably being hidden by his nobility away from trouble because he wasn't the man to sort it out. I think what Cade's rebellion shows us is that England at this point needs decisive leadership. The question is, where's it going to come from?
Jack Cade was looking to put the Duke of York back in his rightful position. That was quite a reasonable assumption for everyone to make, that York was the person that should make a difference to a king who couldn't rule properly. And Jack Cade was out to prove that.
In the wake of the rebellion and Somerset's return from France, York decided to leave Ireland and march to London, hoping to gather supporters as he went. York presented himself as a reformer, a champion of better government, seeking justice against those that had lost English territory in Normandy. Although Somerset was locked up in the Tower of London for his own safety, York's action won little support from the other nobles, and he eventually slunk off to his lands in Ludlow, while his arch-rival took control of the king's government.
York returns to England in the autumn of 1450, about 3 months after Cade's rebellion has faded. Why had he come back? He shouldn't have come back without the king's permission, but he does. Now, he says he's come back to help the king deal with the problems, but a skeptic might suggest that if that was his real motive, perhaps he should have come back 3 months earlier when Cade's rebellion was in full flow. His personal motive seems to have been to ensure his own position, perhaps to become the king's chief counsellor instead of Somerset. Now, Somerset was now back in England from Normandy. York knew this. He probably didn't want his rival to get a step ahead of him. So York returns, and he campaigns, in effect, to head the council and to push Somerset aside. But he does it in perhaps a ham-fisted way. He's certainly associated, right or wrong in people's eyes, with Cade's rebellion because the rebels had bandied his name about as somebody who could put things right. So the nobility seem to have not really trusted York. He makes his attempt, but he doesn't succeed. Somerset is in position as the king's chief counsellor, and Somerset and York, having come back, then really is a political outcast. The nobility, as they had done in the 40s, group themselves around the king and around Somerset. They offer a united front, including the Nevilles, who later become York's allies. So York is really isolated, and it's going to take something quite dramatic to change that.
With the ineffective Henry as king, the Lancastrian administration was still weak. Nobles looking after their own interests began to openly flout his authority. Private wars started between noble families who were determined to settle their differences by the sword. One of these was in the north, where the Percys, based here at Warkworth Castle in Northumberland, and the Nevilles, two of the largest and most powerful families in the kingdom, came to blows.
England was a kingdom, and the Scottish border was right down to Berwick in those days, and the Marcher Lords were put in charge of the border, And these were either a Neville or a Percy. It always had been like that in the late medieval period. The Nevilles were the ones that were after the power in the marriage market, for instance. They could marry their people off into families. Then they obviously devolved more power from the king. The Percys were always regarded as the kings of the north, right back to Hotspur's days. But the fact was that their lands were so closely conjoined together, then it was inevitable that these two great families would have problems when it came to looking after the border for the king.
The Percys had been the dominant family in the 14th century, but their power had failed at the turn of the century when they rebelled against Henry IV. The Nevilles had risen. But despite that, for the first half of the 15th century, the two families had stayed on reasonable terms. Things went wrong at the end of the 40s. There seems to have been problems on a military expedition to Scotland. The Percys felt that they'd been let down by the Nevilles. One of the members of the Percy family were captured. They blamed the Nevilles for this. So it's a late outburst, but very rapidly goes downhill. While the senior members of the family look on, the younger sons seem to have the freedom to raid each other's lands. Now, this is where a strong king should have stepped in and dealt with the problem. But there was no strong king. Orders came from London telling them to behave, but nobody expected there to be any firm action behind that. So they just carried on.
In the year 1453, there was happier news. Queen Margaret fell pregnant. Unfortunately, the glad tidings were overshadowed by news of the king's complete mental breakdown. Perhaps it was the English army's loss of Bordeaux which tipped him over the edge. Calais was now the only remaining English territory in France. This defeat was enough to officially end the 100 Years' War. The king's illness lasted for the best part of a year, and during that time the Queen gave birth to Edward, his son and heir. For the Queen, this was the central moment in her life. She never stopped trying to secure her son his birthright, the throne of England.
In the summer of 1453, everything actually seemed to be going well. Somerset had established effective government. Parliament had voted the king money for an expedition to France. Things were looking more positive than they had been for 2 or 3 years. And then in the summer, Henry falls into a trance, and he stays in that trance for the best part of 18 months.
The reasonable prognosis is that we had something like catatonic schizophrenia. He was a vegetable at part of the time. He couldn't speak, he couldn't hear.
Perhaps you might say that actually this is a little different from what had gone on before, but it creates a problem. Who is to be the figurehead of government?
York was the obvious choice at that time because he was the heir to the throne.
On the other hand, the king's madness was rather good news for the Duke of York, who had recently made himself a very powerful new friend by the name of Richard Neville, the 16th Earl of Warwick. A member of the Neville family, Warwick was extremely rich, highly influential, and a very good man to have on your side, particularly when the Queen and her favourite, Somerset, were set against you. His father was the Earl of Salisbury, another very powerful nobleman with Yorkist sympathies. History remembers Warwick as the kingmaker, and with good reason, as we shall see. With land and possessions that included Warwick Castle, Warwick used his powerful connections to get the Duke of York appointed Protector of the Realm in 1454. It was the death of the Chancellor, Archbishop Kemp, that gave York and Warwick the opportunity they had been looking for.
The Chancellor is the person who makes government work. You must have a Chancellor, and with Kemp dead, we need a new one. And the person who appoints the new Chancellor is the King or the figurehead, and suddenly there's nobody to appoint a new Chancellor. Therefore, England needs somebody to stand in the King's place. It needs a protector. And that position goes to York, largely because by now he's got the support of the Nevilles. Now, the Nevilles had been on the King's and Somerset side 2 years earlier, but they've swapped. And the reason they've swapped sides is, A, because Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the son, had a quarrel that developed between him and Somerset over land in Glamorgan. It was a family inheritance. Both had a claim to the land, but Warwick's desire to keep his lands in Glamorgan separates him from Somerset and the court. He looks around for somebody who might be able to support him. Who is there? Well, York is the possibility if York has power. So the Nevilles are keen to push York into power to help them against Somerset.
With Warwick and Salisbury's support, York busied himself trying to sort out the nation's calamitous finances. The Queen was not asked for her opinion on the matter, while the slippery Somerset, still smarting from the military disaster in France, suddenly found himself detained in the Tower of London. English history might have looked very different indeed had Henry VI not suddenly recovered his sanity on Christmas Day 1454. It would probably have been better for all if he hadn't, because his recovery made civil war all but inevitable. Although he was well enough to resume power, Henry soon came under pressure again from his scheming Lancastrian favourites. At their prompting, he unceremoniously sacked York as protector. Worse still, Somerset, the black heart of the Lancastrian side, was released from the Tower to resume his intriguing and politicking.
When Henry's son was born, it made a lot of difference because obviously that made York and Somerset on a par. The fact that York, when he became protector, put Somerset in the Tower of London and got rid of him and installed a Yorkist government was probably the main reason why there should be a volte-face after that, when Somerset was released, when Henry became sane again, and then Henry decided that York would have to be removed. And so the status quo, if you like, was re-established.
If you look at this from Somerset's point of view, he's now back in power, but he must think, well, what happens if the king falls ill again? Will I be back in prison or worse? York must be thinking, I'm now an outcast. What's going to happen to me? Both presumably thinking about what the other might do, worried whether the other one might attack them. And it's Somerset who takes action. He calls a great council for May, and York and the Nevilles aren't invited. They clearly fear they're going to be charged with treason, and they summon their forces. And this time, they're not going to take political action. They've decided that they're going to take action by force if necessary.
York, Warwick and Salisbury returned to their estates and began to raise armies and plan a challenge to the king's authority. They realized that the only way to get the better of the king and his rotten advisors was by military force. The first battle of the Wars of the Roses was now just a few short weeks away. It came at St Albans, a town about 20 miles north of London, on May 22nd, 1455. Today, St Albans is a beautiful but busy cathedral city, much visited and admired for its stunning architecture, with a history that stretches back to Roman times. In the mid-15th century, it provided the backdrop for a fairly minor battle, but one that caused major political waves. In fact, at first, neither side seemed that keen to actually fight. The Lancastrian forces, with the King, Henry, and the Duke of Somerset among their number, arrived at St Albans first and took up defensive positions in the town. While outside the town, the Yorkist army made camp and waited while talks to avoid a battle took place.
Because there was, prior to that, no fighting, no skirmishing apart from in the north with the Percy and the Nevilles, it was probably the Nevilles that were more antagonistic towards what might happen than York was. In fact, there was like 5 heralds that went one way or the other, negotiating why things shouldn't be done properly and why Somerset shouldn't be handed over to York, and then the king could continue on his progress. But that wasn't to be. Everything went totally out of hand, and the Yorkists attacked.
It's really the Yorkists getting their retaliation in first, before they fear they're charged with treason.
It was York who led a full frontal assault through St Albans' narrow streets, but he was beaten back by the determined Lancastrians. While this was going on, Warwick was leading his men through the back lanes and gardens of an undefended part of the town. Suddenly, they burst into St Albans Market Square, catching the Lancastrian troops completely by surprise. In the close quarter fighting which followed, men fought hard with both swords and axes. There was no time for fancy swordplay. It was a case of killing the enemy by whichever means. Stuart Ivinson and Dean Davidson of the European Historical Combat Guild explained.
These kind of slashing actions are not going to work against our opponent. The cuts won't deliver the damage that we need to. So on occasions, a man-at-arms may go into a half-sword technique. What he's looking for there are openings or gaps in the armour, particularly under the armpit, or in gaps where the armour joins, which will stop the armour from articulating and will cause damage to the flesh underneath, or it could be aimed in at the throat or neck area where they're very vulnerable, unless he's got good protection there, and in at the groin, which is not usually well protected with tin, it's more protected with mail.
Warwick's surprise assault carried the day. For the Lancastrians, there was no time to fight back. Warwick's men attacked without mercy and routed them. It could hardly have been worse for the Lancastrian side. Beneath the site of the Castle Inn, the Duke of Somerset himself, who, it is said, had dreamed he would die within sight of a castle, was caught by the Yorkist army and hacked to death. To complete a total victory for York and Warwick, King Henry himself was captured. Abandoned by his servants, he had apparently suffered another of the mental breakdowns that had plagued him throughout his life. Meanwhile, those Lancastrians lucky enough to have escaped the slaughter simply fled the town. The Battle of St Albans was over. Somerset was dead, and two other powerful Lancastrian supporters, the Earl of Northumberland and Lord de Clifford, had also been killed. Henry VI was safely tucked away, once again in the throes of madness. All in all, it was a highly satisfactory day's work for Warwick, and particularly for York, who, with the king once more indisposed, returned to wield complete power as protector of England. With her army beaten and her husband mad, Queen Margaret was forced once more to watch balefully from the sidelines.
The fact that the Nevilles were there meant that some of the Percys were going to get killed at some point, and that's exactly what happened. But it was more like an extension to what happened in the north, because they'd been warring in the north for a few years before that, although there was only really one real battle. But St Albans gave them the opportunity to actually cause something to happen and to cause bloodshed on quite a wide scale, which they'd never resorted to in the north.
On the streets are the dead bodies of Somerset, York's rival, and the Earl of Northumberland, the main rival of the Nevilles. But everybody is shocked because a battle had taken place in the presence of the king. And what was even worse, the king had been wounded with an arrow in the neck. This was a really shocking event amongst people who prided themselves on their loyalty to the crown. St Albans wasn't a battle for the crown. It was a battle between Somerset and York over who was his chief minister. And when it was over and Somerset was dead, York knelt at Henry's feet and pledged his loyalty to the king.
It seemed that both sides were given a severe jolt by St Albans. Perhaps nobody had expected their differences to be resolved by any actual fighting. And so there was an uneasy truce, which lasted as long as it took for Henry VI to get well again. That was in February 1456, and the king celebrated his return to health and power by immediately sacking York once more. By now, Queen Margaret was pulling all the strings. She hated the Duke of York, she hated Warwick and the entire Neville family, and she was more determined than ever to secure the throne for her son Edward. It was while they were at Kenilworth Castle in the Midlands of England, far away from the febrile atmosphere at court in London, that she persuaded Henry to dismiss all officials appointed by York and replace them with more suitable pro-Lancastrian courtiers. Not surprisingly, it didn't go down well.
Now, Margaret's position was really difficult because a queen in the 15th century was not expected to be a leader. Very much like a Victorian child, a queen was expected to be seen and not heard. Her behaviour had to be very, very carefully pitched.
You always find her behind the great decisions, and the king was never there, because the king was always elsewhere. But Margaret was right there. She was a very, very forceful woman who was very, very determined to keep her own son in line for the throne. And I think Margaret's objective was to make her son more powerful and more feared by the nobles than Henry was, because I think probably she saw what it was causing and what divisions it could cause within the nobility.
For reasons we don't really understand, Margaret doesn't trust York. She seems to see him as a threat to her husband and son. And the new Duke of Somerset and the new Earl of Northumberland clearly felt that their fathers had been killed at St Albans and they wanted revenge on York and the Nevilles. It's perhaps very surprising that peace lasts 4 years, 4 long years. Both sides, because they distrusted each other, had been building up support, building up armament. There was probably an assassination attempt on Warwick in London. And in 1459, it all explodes again.
In June 1459, Queen Margaret summoned all of the great nobles of England to a council at Coventry. All were invited bar two, the Duke of York and the Earl of Warwick. If the Queen was trying to goad the Yorkists into action, she succeeded brilliantly. Despite all this, it is doubtful that Warwick and York were intent on overthrowing the king. What they wanted was the removal of what they saw as his bad counsellors. There seemed little prospect of doing this by peaceful means. They would have to rely on military muscle. After a summer spent putting their armies together, the very fed-up Warwick and York met up at Ludlow Castle, York's stronghold in the Welsh marches. There, they awaited the arrival of the Earl of Salisbury's forces, who were marching from Middleham Castle in Yorkshire to join them. The thought of this huge Yorkist force gathered together in one place worried the King and Queen enough to order a Lancastrian army, commanded by Lord Audley, to intercept Salisbury's men. The place Audley chose to meet them was Blore Heath in the Midlands.
Blore Heath was quite an unusual battle in that it wasn't fought between York and Margaret, for instance. York was in Ludlow at the time. And the battle was fought between the Nevilles and Queen Margaret, if you like, or Lord Audley and his nobles. There was quite a large battle for the standards of the time between the forces which were opposite each other across a very, very, what seemed to be a very, very large ditch.
The battle opened with the customary longbow exchange, which failed to inflict a telling blow on either side. But soon, a fake retreat by some of Salisbury's forces tricked the Lancastrians into attacking, and the two sides met in a thunderous clash of steel. For a fully armoured man-at-arms, the physical strain of battle was immense.
The soldiers have to be very fit, very able, very agile. Depending on the rank would depend on what weapons and equipment you would be using. But there are kind of depictions of a rotating front line of man-at-arms to allow the injured men to come off, to allow new troops to reinforce them, and any armour would have kept an element of their force in reserve to be able to be fresh, ready to then join in the fight when necessary. But the majority of the time, we're talking about people having to run long periods or walk long periods in armour and then be ready to fight once they get into position.
Fighting in armour like this isn't easy. The armour that we wear, generally speaking, is actually heavier and less well made than the armour that the men-at-arms in the Middle Ages wore. And also, they were better trained to it. So running around in 3 stone of armour for them was less of a problem than it is for us. The weight is less of an issue than the actual heat which you generate inside it. Because if you imagine the arming jackets that we're wearing underneath are quite thickly padded, so you're effectively wearing a blanket to begin with, and as soon as you start to run around and be active in the armour, you start to get hot and you start to sweat. The metal stops all that sweat from evaporating away, so you do begin to heat up very quickly. And you know, there are occasions in medieval chronicles where it's recorded that people did actually suffocate in their own armour or just dropped of heat exhaustion on a hot day.
We can be sure then that medieval battle was an exhausting business. What we can't be sure of is what exactly happened at the Battle of Blore Heath. Like so many battles of the era, the chronicles are lacking detail. What is certain is that it was a Yorkist victory. Broadly, the Lancastrian commander had been killed, but it was what hadn't happened that most concerned the Yorkists. Salisbury had been promised the support of the Stanley family, one of the most powerful in the land. They were nowhere to be seen. It was a worrying sign, although Warwick, as Constable of Calais, could still call on the Calais garrison to strengthen his army.
The real strength that the Yorkists have during the 1450s is that Warwick is captain of Calais. Now, Calais is a town on the French coast which still has an English garrison controlled by the English. That means that Warwick has access to a professional group of soldiers and shipping. And if he needs to use either, then he's got a tremendously valuable resource there.
But within 3 weeks, the pendulum had swung in favour of the Lancastrians with their spectacular victory at Ludford Bridge on October 12, 1459. Treachery and deceit were common enough during the Wars of the Roses, and at Ludford Bridge the experienced troops of the Calais garrison, commanded by Andrew Trollope, switched sides, virtually deciding the outcome of the battle. Trollope was obviously not a devout Yorkist, because the reward for his treachery was a full pardon from a Lancastrian king. York didn't stick around to argue the point. He slipped away from Ludford Bridge under cover of darkness, leaving behind his wife Cecily and his 2 youngest sons George and Richard, who were captured and imprisoned at Coventry. While York headed for the safety of Ireland, Warwick and Salisbury, with York's eldest son Edward, Earl of March, in tow, made for Calais in France. The Duke of York's army simply melted away. The saying goes, to the winner the spoils, and the spoils for the Lancastrian army after Ludford Bridge were orgies of rape and pillage in nearby Ludlow. The terrible scenes there were a stain on King Henry's reputation. After St Albans and Blore Heath, perhaps even the Lancastrians could not believe the sudden change in their fortunes. Queen Margaret, who effectively ruled England, lost no time in pressing home her advantage. With all her enemies overseas, a Bill of Attainder passed by Parliament in November 1459 confirmed them as traitors and confiscated their lands and titles. It was the most extreme punishment possible, and it raised the stakes in the game even higher.
An Act of Attainder, which was an Act of Parliament, was the worst punishment that could be inflicted upon an individual, because it didn't just affect an individual, it affected his family. That Act of Parliament, that Act of Attainder, convicted an individual of treason. This meant that when caught, he would be executed, but it was worse than that. It meant that all his property and land was confiscated to the Crown. So not only was this person convicted of treason, but his family lost all their wealth. So the whole family was disinherited. It was a punishment not just aimed at the individual, but at the family in perpetuity. That's why it was so harsh. And that's actually why it was such a dangerous punishment to inflict. It could finish somebody off, but at the same time, if that person was free, it actually forced him into fighting back.
There was no real return, I don't think, for the Yorkists. I mean, they had no alternative but to invade the kingdom as best they could.
With the help of Warwick's uncle, Lord Fauconberg, they plotted, raided the Kent coast, and plundered Lancastrian ships. And in June 1460, Warwick, Salisbury, and the Earl of March landed at Sandwich in the county of Kent and marched on London. Gathering support along the way, they eventually arrived in London on July 4th. They entered the capital unopposed, mainly because the king and his army were away in the north at Northampton. Salisbury was elected to hold on to London, while Warwick and the Earl of March advanced towards the Lancastrian positions. The Lancastrians, commanded by the Duke of Buckingham, were probably not unduly concerned. After all, they held a superb defensive position, were well prepared, and had vastly superior artillery. What they did not have, however, was control of the weather, nor could they have foreseen the treachery of a certain Lord Grey of Rutland.
They put a stockade up, we're told, with earthworks at the side of the River Nene, and the Yorkists aimed to attack it. They caused a problem within the ranks of the Lancastrians, in so much as Lord Grey, for instance, he was forced at some point in the battle, we're told, to defect and help the Yorkists over the barricades, which he in fact did, because I think probably at that point the weather had gone against certain things happening within the Lancastrian camp. The guns wouldn't fire, for instance. They had quite a lot of ordnance in there. And I think if the Yorkists had have attacked at that point, then they would have come to some grief, and they probably wouldn't have won at all. But the combination of that and treachery, which becomes such a feature of the Wars of the Roses, caused the gaining of the camp. And of course, at this point again, we've got the Yorkist lords going to the king saying, "We're sorry, we're sorry for what we've done, and sort of like we've come to save you," and taking the king back into the capital and saying the king is safe, but we're the government.
So the wheel of fortune had turned once again, and the Yorkists headed for London with the hapless king. While Warwick assumed control of the government, being careful, naturally, to reward his friends and family with plum jobs, the Duke of York returned to England and made a triumphal march towards London to claim the throne he believed was his by right. However, his reception at Westminster on October 10, 1460, was not as enthusiastic as he would have wished.
York arrives at Westminster. He marches into a meeting of the Lords, walks straight up to the throne, puts his hand on the throne and turns to the assembled Lords as if he's expecting applause or cries of "Long live King Richard." And there's a ghastly silence. The first words come from the Archbishop of Canterbury, who says, "Have you come to see the King, my lord?" York had misjudged the situation. He clearly was expecting acclaim, and he got nothing of the kind. He slams out of the room, bursts into the royal quarters, and he leaves the Lords a problem. York has now claimed the throne, but Henry's king. How are they going to deal with it?
The English are supposed to have a gift for expediency, especially in political matters. The Act of Accord of October 24, 1460, proved the point. It recognised York as heir to the throne and established him as protector of the realm, but ensured that Henry remained as king. It was a neat solution, the downside of which was that it completely disinherited Edward, Prince of Wales, the King and Queen's own son.
York was, at this point, was probably more fearful than any time he was in his reign. Basically, he wanted to secure what he had, and the only way he could secure what he had was to gain some kind of authority, and the greatest authority at that time was the heir to the throne. The Commons, for instance, the nobles and everyone else at that time were under the umbrella, if you like, of the Yorkist government. So everyone seemed to go along with it, including Henry, because Henry was the man, really, that should have said, no, that's not appropriate. You know, that we don't want that. I want my son to reign after me, and you don't want to do that. Let's all pack our bags up, get our men together and go invade France. But, of course, Henry never did that.
What this tells us is that the Lords are so desperate for peace that they will seize on any kind of compromise that will give them the chance of peace. And it is a desperate compromise, and it doesn't work.
Queen Margaret was beside herself with rage, but, as we have seen, she was not a woman to crumble in the face of setbacks. She worked tirelessly to raise a new Lancastrian army. The Dukes of Somerset and Devon rallied to her side. They were joined by the Earl of Northumberland. It was all worrying enough for York and Salisbury to quickly travel north to the Lancastrian heartlands to face this new threat head-on. They arrived at Sandal Castle near Wakefield, Yorkshire, on December 21st, 1460. But within days, they were under siege by the Lancastrians. The events at Sandal provide English history with a fascinating question. Why, when he could see that his own force was vastly outnumbered by the Lancastrian army, did York decide to leave Sandal Castle to fight on open ground?
Exactly what happened at Wakefield is quite simply a mystery. I mean, the trouble with Wakefield is that the few chronicles that tell us about it were written in the south, almost 200 miles away, with no insight into what was going on in the minds of York or Salisbury. We don't know exactly why he was beaten. He seems to have underestimated his enemy. He seems to have been lured out of Sandal Castle. He seems to have been tricked, but quite why we can't be certain. It may have been a professional soldier from Calais, Sir Andrew Trollope, who was prominent in tricking him.
It was taunted out of the castle or made to come out of the confines of the castle to either rescue his foragers, for instance. There was one story that some of the Lancastrians were dressed in Warwick's livery and York came out to greet them. But either way around, he was killed and a lot of the nobles were killed with him. It was a complete wipeout of the Yorkist cause in Yorkshire.
Whatever the reasons, York had made a horrible and very costly mistake. In the vicious fighting that followed, the weapon of choice for the man-at-arms was the mighty poleaxe. When wielded with expert hands, even a suit of armour offered little protection against a truly fearsome weapon.
Okay, we've got an example of a poleaxe, a bec de Corbin, or that's what it's loosely based on. Each of the poleaxes are slightly different, but tend to consist of a mallet or mallet, a beak at the back, we've got a dag at the top, and right the way down at the bottom we've got the queue. It would equally be as spiked as the top. Effectively, the poleaxe is used in many different ways, but constitutes what we may refer to as a medieval tin opener. The idea being that it penetrates sections of armour, or the mallet section is used to stop the armour from articulating.
The weapons themselves were highly efficient and very effective killing implements. Even though I'm wearing a complete armour, as we've mentioned, there are enough gaps in it that something like a poleaxe in the hands of a skilled user can find those gaps. Even if the person wielding a weapon such as this wasn't actually aiming to hit the gaps in my armour, and if you imagine taking the mallet round the side of the head, even in a helmet, it's going to at least stun me. The shockwave might even fracture my skull despite the protection and the padding I'm wearing. Similarly, receiving a blow to the shoulder could fracture the bones underneath, even if it doesn't damage the armour. But the armour itself can be bent and buckled out of shape, which then prevents my joints from working properly, prevents me from working properly, and then makes me a very vulnerable target. The other thing to think about is the way the armour is actually constructed. It's held together with a combination of leather straps and points which hold it in position. The points are these laces which you can see coming through the holes. Now, another technique which soldiers can use is either by intention or by good fortune, sever some of these straps and laces, and you find portions of the armour begin to dislodge and begin to fall away. So after a while of fighting, you might find that your armour was actually slipping or beginning to drop off, again making you more vulnerable. So it's never an easy thing, you know, to actually fight. And these weapons were definitely up to the job.
The Battle of Wakefield claimed more than 2,000 Yorkist lives. To cap a glorious victory, Warwick the Kingmaker's father, the Earl of Salisbury, then 60 years old, and York's 17-year-old second son, Edmund, Earl of Rutland, were captured and executed. The head of the Duke of York, the man who would be king, was put on display above the gates of York. To reinforce the message to all those who looked upon the grisly remains, a paper crown was placed upon it. The severed heads of Salisbury and Rutland completed the gruesome scene. Queen Margaret had had her revenge.
We've got another blood feud which is starting. For instance, Edward is in Wales, knows that his father's been killed. Warwick knows his father's been killed. We've got new Somerset, new Northumberland, their fathers have been killed. And I think the perpetuation of the Wars of the Roses has got a lot to do with the blood feuding aspects of the wars, because there were so many issues at that stage. It had gone past York, because York was dead. It had gone past a York-Somerset feud. It was more about a dynastic change than anything else, and Edward was quite willing to make that dynastic change.
Wakefield appeared to be a disaster. York was dead, Salisbury was dead. But in practice, it was only the beginning of Yorkist success, because York's death, strange though it may sound, was actually the best thing that could have happened for the Yorkists. Because York had spent 10 years saying, I am not a rival for the throne. I don't want the throne. Henry as king. He'd spent 10 years declaring his loyalty, and then, after the Battle of Northampton, he turned round and said, I am rightful king. So either he'd been lying or he'd been fooling people. Why should anybody trust him? Now he was dead, and he was replaced by his eldest son, Edward. Young, attractive, vibrant, and he was going to be a good soldier. He was going to be a much better leader than York could ever have been.
The Lancastrian victory opened the way for another round of looting and rape by soldiers promised booty by the Queen as payment for their services. Churches and chapels were plundered. Priests and clergymen who resisted were murdered where they stood. They were, said a contemporary chronicle, like a whirlwind, devoted to spoil and rapine, covering the earth like so many locusts over a space 30 miles in breadth. Wakefield had been a disaster for the Yorkist cause, but not all was lost. London was still held by the Earl of Warwick, and Edward, Earl of March, was at Gloucester, still with his army intact. With the death of his father, March was now the principal Yorkist claimant to the throne. Fortunes fluctuated over the next few months as both sides vied for position. On February 2nd, 1461, at Mortimer's Cross, near the Welsh border, the Earl of March defeated a Lancastrian army commanded by Jasper Tudor, the king's own half-brother, who somehow managed to evade capture after the battle. The victory was a welcome relief to the Yorkists after the disaster at Wakefield. On the morning of the battle, it is said 3 suns apparently appeared in the sky, which was interpreted as a sign of divine providence by the Yorkists. During the battle, Edward demonstrated the qualities that made him such a formidable opponent to the Lancastrians in the coming months.
Mortimer's Cross tells us 2 things. Firstly, God was on Edward's side. At least that's what Edward said. The 3 suns shining in the sky on the morning of Mortimer's Cross. A clear sign that Edward was the chosen one. He could use that, and he did use it very effectively as propaganda.
Mortimer's Cross was a very theatrical event, and you can imagine that if 3 suns appears in the heavens, what you might say today, you might say, well, that's parahelion. And we know what that is. We know that that's ice crystals refracting in the atmosphere. But in those days, obviously, not a lot of people had seen a parahelion before. Edward changed this right round, and it became heraldic symbolism. It became the Father, the Son, and Holy Ghost who were with them. God was with them against the Welshmen, for instance. That was the tack that Edward used, I think, at Mortimer's Cross.
It showed that he was a good soldier, both strategically, and he was a man who led from the front, who could inspire from the front. And England hadn't had somebody like this for decades.
Edward was 19 about at the time, and he was 6'3", we're told. He was a typical medieval warrior. He liked fighting, an athletic type, in full armour, and in full black armour, which he used to wear. He was quite a formidable character. And he gained a lot of support at that time. I think that was quite important. That he gained the respect, for instance, of the captains like Herbert, Hastings, Falkenberg, for instance, who was 60 at that time, and knew the potential, I think, of a king like this.
But Yorkist joy at their victory at Mortimer's Cross was short-lived. It was overshadowed by events at St Albans, where 6 years previously the Yorkists had celebrated a great victory. This time, the outcome of the battle fought on February 17th was very different.
The Second Battle of St Albans, coming within a couple of months of Wakefield, was another Yorkist disaster. York had been killed at Wakefield, and now Warwick had been beaten. Warwick was the man of fame. He was the man who people expected to be successful, and he'd been beaten, largely because of failures of generalship. The Yorkists had built themselves an effective defensive position, but then Warwick seems to have tried to move his army to another position, thinking that the Lancastrian army was some distance away, and they weren't. They took him by surprise. The Yorkists were caught out in the open. They didn't have their forces in a defensive array, and they disintegrated. The leaders fled. Warwick headed for the Midlands, heading towards Edward. It really was a disaster. Wakefield and St Albans together made it really look as if the Yorkist cause was over, and London had been left open to Margaret and the Lancastrians.
The people of London had heard all about the terrible events after the Lancastrian victories at Ludford Bridge and Wakefield. They were not about to risk a repeat in the capital. When the victorious king and queen arrived at the gates of the city, they were refused entry. The queen even sent her army far away into Kent to calm the fears of the people. It made no difference. Henry and Margaret were still denied entry to their own capital city. So, while the king and queen sloped away from London, and the Lancastrian army headed for York, Edward, Earl of March, arrived in the city at the end of February 1461 and was given a hero's welcome. Edward and the Yorkists sensed that their time had come at last. This unexpected opportunity, despite the terrible defeat at St Albans, simply had to be taken. So it was that Warwick the Kingmaker proclaimed that Henry VI was no longer king. He would be replaced by the Earl of March, who would reign as Edward IV. The announcement was made by the Bishop of Salisbury, who, by happy chance, just happened to be Warwick's brother. Aged just 19, Edward was crowned king on March 4th, 1461.
The chronicles suggest that Edward was seen as a new beginning, somebody who could change the situation, could put an end to this conflict that had been taking place. And a very different man, this young, vigorous soldier, utterly different from Henry VI, the kind of king that England needed. And he was proclaimed king. But of course this now meant that there were two people wearing the crown, Edward and Henry. So there was going to be a showdown. There had to be a climactic final battle which decided which of them was to keep the crown.
When it came, that battle took place on a freezing day near a small village in the county of Yorkshire. 80,000 men went into battle that day, and both sides resolved that no quarter would be given. There was slaughter on an almost unimaginable scale. This was the Battle of Towton.
Towton was quite a unique battle. It was a battle where the two powers of equal recruitment came together. Two commissions of array, for instance, were enacted, where the king in the north would basically enact his commissions of array in the north and would gather a large army round him with the nobles of the north, and the south with Edward and Warwick with equal powers of commission could gather another army which was of equal size. It's quite a unique event. Never again was that possible, and I think at the time and the amount of men that were embroiled in the conflict at Towton is quite an interesting thing to remember with regard to how many men fought there, how many died, was it as bloody as it was made out to be, and why commentators afterwards said that this was a very, very major event.
The exact strength of the two armies at Towton will never be known, but it is thought that some 42,000 Lancastrians fought with 36,000 Yorkists. What is sure is that the Lancastrians had the larger army. Almost half of English nobility took part in the fighting. Most of them were Lancastrians.
So we're actually now on the side of Saxton Field. It's the field that the Yorkists actually camped out in the night before the battle, after their long march up from London, stopping off at Pontefract, camping out there, and then making for Saxton, ready for the Battle of Towton the day after. From their starting point from Saxton Field, the Yorkists literally do have an uphill struggle. They have to make for the horizon and the edge row right on the top of the shot, right the way towards the tree that's roughly in the centre of the battlefield. It is for them an uphill struggle. Once they reach the top of that ridge, on the other side they will find the Lancastrians waiting for them. This is going to be a rather nasty engagement.
It was a bitingly cold day, with a strong, bitter wind and lots of snow showers. The Lancastrians held the better position, but the weather gods had decided to even up the fight. The gusting wind was coming from directly behind the Yorkist army, blowing snow directly into the faces of the Lancastrian archers. The strength of the wind gave the Yorkists greater range, and they fired a series of deadly volleys into the Lancastrian troops. Nor was that the only advantage gifted to the Yorkists by the wind. The Lancastrian arrows, fired into the teeth of the gale, fell short of their targets, which meant that the Yorkists could simply gather them up and fire them back. Despite being on the higher ground, the Lancastrians were hit by an almost constant shower of arrows.
As the lines came together, I imagine it must have been pretty terrifying for the individuals involved. As the arrows were falling on your armour, you would hear them thunking into the ground around you, or possibly skipping off your helmet and shoulders. If you were unlucky, one of them might find a gap or a weak spot in the armour and penetrate, in which case obviously you've got the pain of the injury to deal with.
The actual sky turns black. You can't see a thing. The sun's blocked out with the amount of arrows that are coming down, so you could have been well into the hundreds of thousands of arrows.
I imagine all you could do would be to take heart from the fact your comrades were around you, and as you closed the lines, the adrenaline would kick in and you'd probably stop thinking about the fear and just think about getting on with the job. The way to success, the way to survival, was to get through the other army as fast as possible. And I imagine that was all that was really in their minds as they began to fight.
Eventually, many Lancastrians could stand it no longer and began to advance towards the Yorkist positions. Now there was the nightmare of medieval close-quarter fighting.
It would have been sort of hand-to-hand combat, to be wrestled to the ground, then from exhaustion and sheer bodies strewn all over the place, they would have been fighting and pulling bodies away, fighting through the bodies. Then they would have pulled back, taken a rest. As soon as they pulled back, fresh troops come in, continue the hand-to-hand combat, so it would have been in spurts of around about 10 to 15 minutes.
Men hacked at one another with axes, swords and halberds. The bodies were piled so high that sometimes the fighting stopped so they could be cleared away. Then it all started again. Despite hours of savage combat, neither side could gain the upper hand. But the arrival on the battlefield of the Yorkist Duke of Norfolk's men changed all that.
When Norfolk came in, he came in from the side, so basically this turned the whole battle display, if you like, 90 degrees, and the rout took place in Bloody Meadow which was to the west of the battlefield, and then there was a squeeze where the Yorkists actually basically pushed them over the edge into Bloody Meadow and off the battlefield. They are just sort of basically fleeing for their lives.
And once the battle was over and the rout began, I can only assume it was just sheer bloody panic from the side that was actually routing. Once the unit's cohesion, once the army has broken up, you stop being an effective fighting force and just become a group of individuals trying to get away. And that's when the real carnage begins.
There was more terrible bloodshed as the Lancastrians were forced towards the freezing, swirling waters of the Cockbeck. Bridges buckled and broke under the sheer weight of fleeing soldiers, sending many to an icy doom. Those prevented from crossing by the sheer numbers on the riverbank were caught by the Yorkists and slaughtered.
Once they were down in that expanse of freezing water, they were just targets for archers on the hill, for light cavalrymen galloping up and down, picking them off one after the other. It must just have been a scene of the unimaginable slaughter.
But it said that the Cockbeck actually ran red with the blood for many days afterwards.
The Cockbeck eventually became so choked with bodies that men were actually able to get across. There were scenes of horror from Towton to Tadcaster as mutilated Lancastrian bodies were strewn in fields and woods. The Yorkists simply killed as many as they could. No quarter had been promised, and none was given. At not too distant York, Henry, Margaret, and the Duke of Somerset watched with alarm as those Lancastrian troops who had managed to survive the bloodshed limped into the city. Without fully realizing the extent of the catastrophe that had befallen the Lancastrian army, they fled to the safety of Scotland. At this great distance, no one can be completely sure of the number of men who lost their lives fighting at Towton, but it was the largest, bloodiest battle ever fought in England. Estimates put the number of dead at 28,000. It could even have been more. No battle better illustrated the horrors of medieval combat or the sheer brutality which marked the age. But we don't have to rely on our imaginations to visualize the horror of that day. In 1996, workmen uncovered a mass burial pit during work near the battlefield. The remains of 30 fallen soldiers were sent to Bradford University for analysis. Their wounds revealed the shocking reality of medieval warfare.
The major findings which surprised everybody was that there were such massive head wounds and such multiple head wounds to all the individuals within the pit. And what was found that there was relatively few injuries anywhere else on the skeletons, but their heads had been savagely attacked, and these individuals had basically been done to death. As well as the major injuries, there was also a lot of evidence of mutilations, the cutting off of ears or noses, and multiple small cuts which barely went through the skin. The majority of injuries were blunt force injuries, basically where people had had their heads stoved in, basically. But there were also a lot of sharp force injuries where people had been cut with swords or daggers, or their skulls had been pierced by either projectiles, or in more cases, they'd been hit with something like a war hammer or a poleaxe. This is Towton 25. This was a young man in his mid-20s. And why I wanted to show you this is to show you a particularly nasty injury that he'd received, amongst others. And what this shows is this is his upper jaw on the left-hand side. And this shows very clearly that he was cut across here. These were not normal war wounds. They had been overkilled, and there were many more injuries to their heads than would have been necessary, either to fell them or to kill them. It's clear from these injuries that there was an element of viciousness. And the other thing that confirms this is that the majority of the injuries were from the front or from the side, so that the person being attacked would have known full well what was happening to them.
So complete was the Yorkist victory that Edward, supported as ever by Warwick, who was now at the height of his influence and powers, probably considered that the war had been won. The new king, who was a tall man with an impressive physique and genial character, cut a very different figure to the ineffectual, weak Henry VI. But it was Warwick, the man who had made him king, who continued to pull the strings. One French visitor is supposed to have remarked that England actually had two kings. One is Warwick, and there is another whose name escapes me. Meanwhile, Margaret of Anjou continued to do her worst by plotting and raiding castles in the north. Edward tried to deprive her of the support of France and Scotland by making peace with both countries. But the real reckoning came at the Battle of Hexham near Northumberland in the north of England in May 1464. The Lancastrians were trounced. Some even fled before the battle started. Those that stuck around were taken by surprise by the speed of the Yorkist attack. There were terrible echoes of the scenes at Towton 3 years earlier, as men drowned trying to escape across a river called the Devil's Water, or were trampled in the crush, or were cornered and captured.
That puts an end to it. That's where key Lancastrian leaders are caught and executed. Henry is captured and taken south as a prisoner. At that point, the Lancastrian cause really does seem to be at an end. Margaret flees abroad with Prince Edward, but the Lancastrians are finished. The Yorkists are triumphant.
By now, though, Edward himself was beginning to tire of Warwick's influence, and the two men now fell out spectacularly over Edward's marriage plans. Edward decided that Warwick needed taking down a peg or two. So, while Warwick was busy trying to find the king a politically favourable French bride, Edward was wooing and secretly marrying the lovely Elizabeth Woodville, whom he is supposed to have met and courted here at Grafton Regis in Northamptonshire. Warwick was furious, not only because the marriage ruined his plans for a dynastic match, but also because Elizabeth was the widow of a Sir John Grey, a nobleman who had fought and died at St Albans, on the Lancastrian side. To rub salt into Warwick's wounds, Edward celebrated his marriage by showering the entire Woodville family with peerages and giving them influential positions at court.
Now, Edward must have known that this was the wrong thing to do, otherwise he wouldn't have kept that marriage secret. But that was clearly a demonstration that Edward would do things his way and that he wasn't going to do what Warwick wanted.
Warwick was looking at all the new nobility, and that's what it was. It was the new nobility and quite a large family of Woodvilles who were looking to marry in to royal positions. And it was a little bit like his family did in the 1450s, looking for good marriages, power, dominions, land, security, survival.
He had no son, but he had two daughters. Now, it was really important to him who those girls married. He thought about marrying them to the king's brothers, but Edward said no. He thought about foreign marriages, maybe foreign royal family, but Edward said no, which left him with the sons of wealthy noblemen in England, but they were being grabbed by Elizabeth Woodville's sisters. Warwick found himself with two daughters for whom he should be able to arrange really worthwhile marriages, and there were no candidates. That really must have upset him on a deeply personal level.
So, Warwick looked for another family member with whom he could do business. He found one in the shape of the king's younger brother, the Duke of Clarence, whom he managed to persuade to join him in a plot to overthrow the king. The deal was that with Edward gone, Clarence would be rewarded for his treachery with the crown of England. As was usual in medieval times, the way to success was through military muscle. Warwick and Clarence put together an army, and in July 1469 they marched on London. At the same time, Lancastrian supporters in Oxfordshire met and defeated a Yorkist army at Edgecote. This was very bad news for King Edward, but even worse news for Earl Rivers, the Queen's father, and John Woodville, her brother, who were taken prisoners soon after the battle. It was too good a chance for Warwick to miss. He ordered them both to be executed. Now events really gathered pace. The king was captured and briefly made prisoner at Warwick Castle, but by September 1469 he was free again and back at court in London.
Clarence seems to have been handsome, vain, and probably incredibly stupid. Incredibly politically naive. He goes along with Warwick's plotting, and the two of them try to depose Edward, and it's an utter failure. They have no chance of doing this. There is no possibility of there being widespread support for George, Duke of Clarence, as an alternative king, and they're forced to flee abroad.
But even in the Wars of the Roses story, where friendships were fleeting and alliances short-lived, the next twist in the tale was extraordinary. So determined was Warwick to overthrow Edward that he was prepared to join forces with his most bitter rival, Margaret of Anjou.
Is just the most remarkable about-turn that you get in 15th century politics, because suddenly the two arch-enemies, Warwick and Margaret of Anjou, are on the same side. It's the classic, my enemy's enemy is my friend. And even then, Warwick and Margaret, they have to be sort of forced together by the King of France, who says, you two have to work together if you're going to depose Edward. The alliance between Margaret and Warwick is only ever skin deep. Its fragility is demonstrated by the fact that Margaret refuses to let her son, Prince Edward, travel to England with Warwick. She just doesn't trust him to be in control of Prince Edward.
It was in September 1470 that Warwick and Clarence landed with an army in the southwestern county of Devon, joined up with Lancastrian loyalists Lord Oxford and Jasper Tudor, and began to march north. With a Lancastrian army under Warwick's brother, Lord Montague, another who had conveniently changed sides, marching down from the north, King Edward got distinctly nervous about being caught in the middle. Discretion, they say, is the better part of valour, and Edward certainly thought so. He made a lightning escape to England's east coast, where he boarded a ship bound for The Hague, arriving there in early October 1470. While Edward was in exile in Holland, far away from his enemies in England, Warwick completed the astonishing turnaround by releasing the bewildered Henry VI from the Tower and restoring him to the English throne. Warwick was the kingmaker once more.
Henry VI is brought out of captivity and paraded around London. And it's a pitiable sight. This 50-year-old wearing an old blue gown with a handful of supporters, some tattered standards. Londoners were not enthused by this sight. They looked on with pity at King Henry, but they were not going to support this man.
While Warwick tried to build a power base, Margaret and her forces were left to wait on the other side of the Channel. That would prove a costly error. The Duke of Clarence, who had been promised the throne by Warwick, was fed up, very fed up indeed. As well as this, in November 1470, Edward's queen, Elizabeth, gave birth to a son, Edward. The exiled king now had an heir to his throne, if he could get it back. This was precisely what Edward intended to do. He landed with a small force of some 2,000 men at Ravenspur on the River Humber in the north of England in March 1471 and began to march towards the Midlands.
Edward, having been a considerable military success, when he lands in Yorkshire, just shows that he's not just a man of action, he's actually decidedly tricky as well. Because when he lands in Yorkshire, he tells people, I haven't come back to be King of England. I just want to be Duke of York. And that's a wonderful line, because the people who've been ordered to stop him can now turn round to Warwick and say, well, he hasn't come back to challenge the king. He only wants to be Duke of York. I thought that was fair enough. And Edward is able to get entry to York, the city of York, and he travels south. And of course, the further he goes, the more people stand off and the more they think, oh, perhaps he is powerful after all. And perhaps there are more people supporting him. And the further he goes, the more support he builds up, and his old supporters flock to join him. And by the time he's reached the Midlands, he's got a significant army.
With men joining up along the way, more help came from an unexpected source. The Duke of Clarence had decided to abandon Warwick the Kingmaker and rejoin his brother. The dramatic reconciliation was further proof that, during the Wars of the Roses, absolutely nobody's loyalty could be taken for granted. Now, Edward was able to add another 4,000 men to his invasion force as he marched towards London. He made a triumphal entry into the capital city in April 1471. Edward's first act was to seize poor Henry VI once again and relodge him in the Tower of London. Shortly afterwards, the Archbishop of Canterbury recrowned Edward IV, King of England. Now, Warwick the Kingmaker had to be dealt with. The day of reckoning came near Barnet, a small town to the north of London, on April 14th, 1471. Some 20,000 men went into battle in the thick mist of early morning on that spring day. At Edward's side were troops commanded by Lord Hastings and the King's younger brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester. With Warwick were the Lords Oxford, Exeter and Montague. The confused fighting that was typical of any medieval battle was made worse by the thick, clinging mist. Some Lancastrian troops even turned on their own side by mistake as the two armies battered away at one another. But as the mist cleared, the fighting died down, and it became clear that King Edward and the Yorkists had won the day. Edward's triumph was made even sweeter when it emerged that the Earl of Warwick had died in the fighting. The Kingmaker, the man who had dominated English political life for so long, was gone.
Barnet sees the end of Warwick, the death of Warwick the Kingmaker. If the Lancastrians and Warwick had united, if Prince Edward had been there with all the Lancastrian forces behind them, it might have been a different story. But Edward was able to pick off one half of the alliance at Barnet and then turn and deal with the other half, because by now, too late, Margaret and Edward had landed in the southwest, pulled together the Lancastrian forces and were marching north.
And their march into England march towards Wales to try and get support from Wales, while Edward is marching by force marches right behind her, and almost in effect alongside her in a parallel march towards Gloucester and in the end Tewkesbury.
So, on the 4th of May 1471, barely 3 weeks after the Battle of Barnet, Lancastrian and Yorkist armies squared up to one another yet again. The place this time was Tewkesbury.
Tewkesbury was still a difficult battle to win. The Lancastrians took up a good defensive position on a hilltop, and the Yorkist army, to get at them, had to get through woodland, across water-filled dikes. It was a difficult position. But for some reason, it seems the Lancastrians actually came down from their position to attack the Yorkists, but not successfully. And then in retreating, their position was weakened and their army seems to have disintegrated. It was a tough battle, but the Lancastrians were beaten. Most importantly of all, Prince Edward was killed on the battlefield, aged 17. From there, it was just a matter of days before Henry VI was to die too. The Yorkists put out that he died of pure displeasure and melancholy, but I doubt one person in London believed that.
That is effectually it. His reign has got rid of that particular branch of the Lancastrian family. Margaret is captured and is a broken woman. She goes into exile and we don't hear from her again. And effectively, Edward is king in supreme right.
For the moment, England enjoyed a rare period of peace. Edward proved to be a cultivated king and a very shrewd businessman, which swelled the royal coffers. The unusually peaceful times might have seemed too good to be true, and they were. Backstage, family quarrels were threatening to put an end to them.
Clarence, the middle brother, had been reunited with Edward, but never seems to have lost his dreams of glory. He had married Warwick's other daughter, Isabel. But after she died, he developed a plan that he would marry the daughter of the Duke of Burgundy. Well, Edward said no, because an alliance with Burgundy at that stage against France could be very costly indeed. And when he was turned down, Clarence had what, if he'd been a 4-year-old, would probably be best described as a really big tantrum. He seems to have just lost control.
In the end, Edward lost patience. Clarence was arrested, lodged in the Tower, and put on trial for treason. Needless to say, he was found guilty. In February 1478, the game was up for the troublesome brother, and he was privately executed. Tradition has it that he was drowned in a great barrel of Malmsey wine.
He was only 28, Clarence, but he'd packed more stupidity, more misjudgments into his 28 years than most people manage in 3 times that length.
By 1483, Edward's health had deteriorated alarmingly, and in March of that year he fell gravely ill. The king was convinced he was about to die, and began to lay plans that would ensure a smooth succession, sparing the country any more bloodshed and turmoil. He named his eldest son Edward, just 12 years old, as heir to the throne, but with the king's younger brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector during his minority. But very little was ever as it seemed, or as it was ever intended. King Edward, aged just 41, drew his last breath in April 1483, and suddenly his deathbed wishes were as nothing. Those whose sole ambition was to gain power just ignored them. Now the court split into dangerous factions. The Woodville family in particular couldn't stand the thought of Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as sole protector. The king's old friend Lord Hastings hated the Woodvilles and sided with Gloucester. Everyone fought for position and influence, but none jostled harder than Gloucester himself. As far as he was concerned, this was his moment. Had Edward not sired 2 sons, he reasoned he, Gloucester, would be king now.
Richard is fearful. We're coming back to the survival part of the Wars of the Roses, where he's wanting to survive the next bout of what he thinks is going to be the next bout of hostilities against the crown. And he saw this in the Woodvilles quite distinctly, as Warwick did, that they would now try and look after Edward's son, and take him under their wing, and in effect leave Richard out in the cold.
There was rivalry and jockeying for position. Hastings wrote to Gloucester telling him what was happening, and Gloucester headed south. On the way, he meets Edward coming from Ludlow and takes control of the young king, imprisoning his uncle, Lord Rivers, and others, and then sending them north to Pontefract Castle as prisoners.
He remembered what happened in the wars prior to this. He remembered what had happened to various personalities in the wars, and was determined that that was not going to happen to him.
Prince Edward entered London with his uncle at his side on May 4th, 1483. Plans for the young prince's coronation seemed to be going smoothly. Everything changed a month later, however. At a council meeting on Friday, June 13th, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, accused his erstwhile ally, William Lord Hastings, of treason, had him hauled from the meeting and executed without trial. Three days later, armed men were sent to fetch the young prince's brother, Richard. He was snatched from his mother, and both he and his elder brother were taken to the Tower. The 12-year-old Prince Edward and 10-year-old Prince Richard would never be seen outside its walls again. Now a shameless PR campaign was waged by Gloucester's supporters, the aim of which was to prove that the 2 princes were illegitimate and that their claim to the throne was unlawful. Much was made of King Edward's numerous affairs. It was all part of a cold, calculated plan to put Richard on the throne. There was also a murderous campaign against the would-be king's opponents, who were arrested and executed without any pretense of a trial. And it worked. After a suitable period, during which Richard was persuaded by his supporters to take the crown for the good of the country, Richard became king to rule as Richard III in July 1483. So Richard had succeeded. But now there was the small matter of the 2 princes in the Tower to resolve. The fate of the 2 youngsters is still unproven to this very day, and the suspicion that Richard was involved in their deaths ensured his place in royal history as one of its most black-hearted villains.
Was he responsible for the deaths of the princes? Almost certainly yes. He may not have given the order, but the mere fact that he had taken the crown made them vulnerable. And it's almost certain they died in the early summer of 1483. There is no scrap of paper or parchment, no written document that can prove this. I think the best evidence lies not on paper, but in the actions of individuals. Because across that summer and early autumn, a good many men who had been loyal to Edward, who had fought alongside Richard at Barnet and Tewkesbury, turned against him. And they not only turned against him, but they turned to an alternative king, the utterly obscure and unknown Henry Tudor. Why would they do that if they didn't believe that Richard had done something that they could not support?
Henry Tudor was in the dynastic line because of the fact of his ancestry right back through the Earl of Richmond to the Welsh princes, through the Beauforts, for instance, and gradually through Edward III. Very, very tenuous line and claim to the throne, where Richard was a Plantagenet. This was the line, this was the branch that all English kings came from. And I guess a lot of people at that time probably saw Henry Tudor as a journeyman, a person that was looking to be the next king. He's more of an adventurer than anything else. But he gained an awful lot of support, did Richmond.
Rumours that Henry Tudor was planning a coup even prompted Elizabeth Woodville to take some revenge on King Richard for the disappearance of her sons. She offered her own daughter, Elizabeth of York, as a potential bride. Such a match, if it were to happen, would unite the warring houses of Lancaster and York. And in 1485, the king learned that Henry Tudor had mustered enough support to mount an invasion and had landed at Milford Haven in Wales. The time for political intrigue was over. The only way to face down this new threat was on the battlefield. That battle came at Bosworth Field in August 1485. Richard's army far outnumbered that of Henry Tudor. He had perhaps a 3-to-1 advantage, more archers and some serious heavy artillery. But for both sides, the main worry was the force commanded by Lord Stanley, who had turned up unexpectedly but had refused to commit his loyalty to either faction. He and his men simply stood and waited.
Well, this is Ambion Hill. This is the traditional site for where Richard camped on the eve of the Battle of Bosworth. We fly his standard here behind me with these white boar as his personal insignia. And the three armies that we had here at Bosworth were always thought to number around 20,000 in total. An easy breakdown is that Richard had around 10,000, Henry had around 4,000, and Stanley had up to around 6,000. Like all good politicians, he sat on the fence until the very, very last moment.
And so, on the morning of Monday, the 22nd of August, 1485, Henry Tudor faced Richard III at Bosworth. The battle started in the way that other battles started, an exchange of cannon fire, exchange of arrows. The vanguards clashed, the foot soldiers engaged in a slugging battle.
A lot of these soldiers weren't professional. They were farmers by day and being dragged out by their lord and master to come and fight. So for some of them, this would have been their first experience of that warfare. And most people would have been killed by standing 3 feet away from the enemy, the length of a hand sword, and that would have been frightening to the extreme.
But then something remarkably different happened. Richard III led a cavalry charge, an extremely unusual feature during the Wars of the Roses.
A lot of English knights chose to fight on foot, but Richard obviously realised he had to gain a lot of ground quite quickly before Stanley committed himself, and we're led to believe that he went in with a small retinue of knights on horse to try and hit Henry hard.
Richard, wearing his crown, rides across the battlefield straight for Henry Tudor. Perhaps some of the foot soldiers stopped fighting and drew back just to watch what must have been an amazing sight. These knights, a sort of image of chivalry, charging straight for Henry Tudor. It was a huge gamble, and it almost succeeded. Richard's knights ploughed into Tudor's defenders. John Cheney was unhorsed, William Brandon was knocked aside. Richard reached Henry Tudor, and for moments, the two men actually exchanged blows, and afterwards Henry Tudor's supporters admitted they didn't expect him to last. But at the point where Richard appeared to be winning, in came Henry's supporters, the Stanleys. And the Stanleys pushed Richard and his men aside. They were pushed probably into the marshland, and as they lost control of their horses, as they were forced onto the floor, each in turn was killed by dagger or a blow from a poleaxe. Among them, Richard III died on the battlefield. He was only 32. In many ways, potentially a very capable king, but whose whole reign was just dominated by the way he took control in the summer of 1483.
More than 500 years after the battle, Bosworth continues to give up its secrets. In 2009, fieldwork by a team of archaeologists and historians made some startling finds, including lead shot which had been fired during the fighting. After years of doubt, these extraordinary discoveries mean that experts are now more certain than ever of the exact location of the battlefield itself.
The battle centre is up here on the top of Ambion Hill, and this is where the original theory from the Victorian period right the way through to 1985 was set. We've actually now pinned it to an area across the Fen Lane, both north and south of the lane, and that is with archaeological evidence, buckles and little strap ends of things that most people wouldn't give a second thought to, but were intrinsically important for us. Because most of the people who fought here at Bosworth were ordinary, common people. They didn't have great big plate armour and shiny pieces of silver and gold on them. It was copper alloy and iron and the real small pieces that get knocked off in battle but aren't then picked up after that event. And those were what we were beginning to find. That was at least until nearly the last week of the field work, where we first found a piece of round shot. That was crucial. We now had the battlefield. So from finding that first round shot, we now have over 30 round shot across the battlefield. And we know that this is the battlefield because they have all been fired. And you can see that within the ball itself, with this flat on the top of the sphere, where it's been forced up the barrel and out towards the enemy. And that tells us, without any chance of doubt, that that is a fired object. And we have a scatter pattern across the countryside, either side of that Roman road. What we're not sure of, though, is where these round shot had been fired from. Were they all fired from one position? Were they all Richards? Were some of them Henrys? Or indeed, possibly even, were some of them from Stanley? At this stage, though we have a large number, in fact the largest collection in Europe put together, we do not know yet where they were fired from. We were asked one question at the beginning of this project in 2005. Can we find a medieval battle site? Yes, we can. We have it here.
Henry Tudor was crowned on the battlefield of Bosworth. Legend has it that the bloodied crown was found in a hawthorn bush before it was placed upon the king's head. Meanwhile, the battered body of Richard III was slung across a horse and taken to nearby Leicester, where it was put on public display before being buried without ceremony in an unmarked grave. Richard is the only king of England to die in battle. At his coronation in October 1485, Henry Tudor became King Henry VII of England. In 1486, he made good on the promise he had made to the Yorkists who had supported his cause. He married Elizabeth of York. The House of Lancaster and the House of York were at last united.
Henry Tudor's marriage to Elizabeth of York was a very sensible political move. It created the opportunity of increasing unity. And the thing that most people wanted, the nobles and the gentry, was peace. It was what they'd wanted in the 50s. It was what they'd wanted in the 60s and 70s. Each time they thought they'd got peace, it had been snatched away. So what they wanted from Henry Tudor was somebody who could provide firm, decisive government, the very thing that Henry VI in the beginning had been totally unable to provide. If he could provide that, then people would support him. But if the disorder continued, then there would be the chance that he would go the way of other kings who'd been deposed.
Henry VII successfully suppressed revolts and uprisings throughout his reign. But after almost 30 years, the Wars of the Roses were finally at an end. They had blighted the reigns of no fewer than 5 English monarchs. Thousands of men had died trying to decide the destiny of the English crown. Eventually, the seemingly endless battles and political wrangling had ushered in, perhaps, the greatest royal dynasty of them all. Over the next century, the Tudors secured the crown once and for all and changed the face of England forever.
One of the really interesting things is that many, many people wanted peace, and yet it only took a handful of individuals to turn peace into war and violence. The ambitions of a few could very easily dictate the fate of many.
He killed my father, he killed my brother. That's central to a lot of why the wars were perpetuated. The political thing is there for everyone to see, but I think at the very heart of it is the fact that the wars were very primal, and at that time in the Kingdom of England, primal things were important. Family was important, land was important, and survival was important.